Welcome to the Plagues Project.
And Plagues, Many Angles.
Now more than ever.
Come learn with us.
When I think about all that's going on today with our plague of coronavirus, one of the things that stirs me is the confrontation with loss that we're all experiencing on a day-to-day basis. And I think that beyond the physical and the psychic pain that comes with loss, there are also existential and spiritual dimensions that really challenge our sense of centeredness. All this loss violates our sense of who we are in the world and the stability of the world itself. Confrontation with loss presents us with moments of rupture that often lift the veil of our own blindness and compromise the plausibility structures that hold our lives intact. And what I want to look at today, the thing I want to think about with all of you, is how has our Jewish tradition grappled with this loss of centeredness? Are there models that might help us think about it? Are there people who modeled it? Are there frames of thought that might help us actually navigate these times of such tremendous uncertainty? And to do that, I want to start in a perhaps surprising place, and that is in Akedat Yitzchak. And I'm doing so not so much to think about the binding of Isaac itself, but actually about the constellation of events that happen around that. And I want to begin in Genesis 23 with the death of Sarah, Imenu, Sarah, our matriarch. And it says in Genesis 23:1, "Vayihiyu chaye Sarah me'ah shana ve'esrim shana ve'sheva shanim shnei chaye Sarah v'tamat Sarah bekiryat arba hi Hebron ve'eretz Canaan vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah ve'livkota." And the life of Sarah was 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, which is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Avraham came to eulogize Sarah and to weep for her. So here we have the very brief story of the death of Sarah, recounted in the portion called the life of Sarah, Chaye Sarah. And Rashi comments on the proximity of Sarah's death to the experience of the binding of Isaac. And he says, "V'nismecha mitzat Sarah la'akedat Yitzchak, lefi she'al yedei besorat ha'akedah, shenizdamen bena l'shrita v'kim'at shelo nishchat, parcha nishmata mimena umeta." The account of Sarah's demise was juxtaposed to the binding of Isaac because as a result of the news of the binding, that her son was prepared for slaughter and was almost slaughtered, her soul flew out of her and she died. How might we understand this? On the one hand, one could say that Yitzchak's ordeal broke his mother's heart and caused it to shatter, so to speak. But the phrase kim'at shelo nishchat that Rashi uses is arresting. Right? She did not die thinking that her son had died. He did not die and she knew it. And her cause of death somehow was not his death, but his almost death. On this, the Maharal of Prague picks up on this proximity, on this kim'at shelo nishchat, and offers a very stirring account of what it does to a person to come close to almost death, to almost destruction, to live day to day or not with a world undone, with the threat of a loved one gone, with our own health and well-being potentially compromised. What does that do to a person? And the Maharal says about Sarah, this is the Gur Aryeh al HaTorah in Parshat Chaye Sarah. Ela nir'a mipnei shesham'a dekim'at nishchat, v'davar mu'at haya shelo nishchat, lefikach nivhala, sheken derech adam lihiyot nivhal, ka'asher yishma ki b'davar mu'at haya na'aseh lo inyan zeh. It seems, he says, that because Sarah heard that Yitzchak was almost slaughtered, that just a small thing kept him from being slaughtered. For this reason, she was shocked, nivhala. This is the way of humanity, he says, to be shocked upon hearing that only a small thing kept one alive. This is the Maharal, who lived between 1520 and 1609, really trying to isolate the experience of proximity to death, the ways in which one can be shaken from one's core, not by the loss, though that too, of course, can cause tremendous disturbance, but actually by contending just with how close we all live to the brink, how we are all here only by the grace of God, how we wake up in the morning, how we live our lives, how our loved ones continue to surround us when they do, only because of a very, very, very small line that separates between life and death. And it can change at any moment. And that itself is a dizzying awareness. And it is that, he indicates, that actually caused parcha nishmata, caused Sarah's soul to fly from her. That shock, that dizzying awareness. The great contemporary biblical scholar Aviva Zornberg writes about just this in an essay called Cries and Whispers, The Death of Sarah, which can be found in Beginning Anew, a Women's Companion to the High Holy Days. She writes, referencing this piece from the Maharal, what is Bahala, or the shock that he indicated? Again, she says, one could say something like shock, but nivhal is not exactly shock. Nivhal is something like dizziness, even a kind of nausea. It's vertigo. It's not knowing where one is, a shock in the sense of the loss of orientation. I don't know at all where I am in the world. Gur Aryeh says that this is a universal. It's a very common reaction to a situation in which one is almost. The reaction is a sense of theological vertigo, of asking, what does anything mean in that case? If it's really just a matter of a millimeter, it could go this way, it could go that way. How do we understand God's providence? How do we understand anything in view of such events? The interesting thing is that Rashi, as interpreted by the Maharal, indicates that Sarah dies of something like this. She does not die thinking that Isaac is dead. She knows he's alive, but only by a hair's breadth. And that immediately sets everything awry, does something radical to her sense of order and coherence in the world. So Sarah, it seems, on this read, just couldn't live in a world so stripped of meaning and stability. Her son's life was no longer a given. God's protection was no longer a given. Fairness was no longer a given. Maybe her husband's sanity or compassion or character were no longer givens. And her sense of rootedness, reliability was undone. Undone on account of her own suffering and undone on account of her son's. So my interest in these texts is not on Sarah's physical death per se, but on the death of her world as she knew it. Her response to suffering was profound disorientation. Life could not go on. Everything was off kilter once presented with this harsh reality of a seemingly arbitrary universe. And Zornberg's poetic and deeply existential term, theological vertigo, really captures this notion that loss, or importantly, almost loss, destabilizes and calls into question our sense of order or coherence in the world. It rattles our very beings, shakes us from complacence, mocks our sense of safety. It is said that disease causes dis-ease. And as Sarah shows us, it can also cause death of bodies, of course, but also collapse of internal worlds. As we contend with our plague, it seems to me that some of us, at least, those of us frankly blessed to live in proximity to death and not with it directly thus far, face this kind of theological vertigo day in and day out as we watch our world come undone. How might we contend with it? How might we respond to it? How might we live in the face of it? It seems to me that our rabbis in the Talmud had much to say about this. And I'd like to share one section from Tractate Babavatra that I think relates to this question, coming at it from a different point of Jewish history in a different moment of Jewish suffering and tremendous rupture and uncertainty. And that is on the other side of the destruction of the Second Temple. So here we have a text from Babavatra, page 60b. Tanu Rabbanan, Keshacharav Habayit Bashnia, Rabu Prushim B'Yisrael, Shalo le'echol basar v'shalo lishtot yayin. Our rabbis taught when the temple was destroyed for the second time, large numbers of people in Israel became ascetics, binding themselves neither to eat meat nor to drink wine. Rabbi Joshua got into conversation with them and said to them, "My sons, why do you not eat meat or drink wine?" They replied, "Shall we eat flesh which we used to bring as an offering on the altar, now that this altar is in abeyance? Shall we drink wine which used to be poured as a libation on the altar, but now is no longer?" He said to them, "If that is so, we should not eat bread either, because the meal offerings have ceased." And they said, "You're right, that is so. We'll manage with fruit." "We should not eat fruit either," he said, "because there is no longer an offering of first fruits or bikurim." "Then we can manage with other fruits," they said. "But," he said, Rabbi Joshua, "we should not drink water then, because there's no longer any ceremony of the pouring of the water or nisuch hamayim." To this they could find no answer. So he said to them this, "My sons, come and listen to me. Not to mourn at all is impossible, because the blow has fallen. But to mourn overmuch is also impossible, because we do not impose on the community a hardship which the majority cannot endure. The sages have therefore ordained thus: a person may stucco their home, but should leave a little bare, a davar mu'at. A person can prepare a full-course banquet, but should leave out an item or two, a davar mu'at. A person can put on all of their ornaments, but should leave off one or two, again, a davar mu'at. And finally, in the context of a wedding, mourning should be introduced in small ways. Rabbi Isaac said, this is symbolized by the burnt ashes which we place on the head of a bridegroom. So we have 4 laws that are offered to maintain memory of destruction without indulging it too much. Because, says Rabbi Joshua, we must always recognize our mourning, but we cannot mourn overly much. We must contain our losses, but we must also retain some consciousness of the awareness born of them. And so that is done in very concrete ways in the Jewish tradition. If one builds a house or paints a house, one is to leave a small part of it unpainted. If one offers a banquet, one is to leave off perhaps an appetizer or something, some element of that. When one gets all dressed up, leave off one piece of jewelry or, again, some other piece of luxury, I suppose. And finally, on a wedding day, we reintroduce a sense of loss and mourning and incompletion by putting ashes on the groom's head, a less known practice, or perhaps breaking a glass. Note the language of davar mu'at here in the Talmud, which brings us right back to the Maharal. Davar mu'at haya shelo nishchat. Here, that same awareness is on display, awareness that the hair's breadth that separates between life and death, coherence and incoherence, is always upon us. And yet we are charged nevertheless to continue to live, to paint, to eat, to celebrate, to get dressed up, to seduce, to marry. That seems to be the rabbinic response to devastating loss. And again, I want to highlight that in containing the losses here, these practices are also retaining that experience, literally keeping it in view. It's not about moving on fully. It's not about pretending that one's home or one's table or one's body or one's relationship is complete. But on the other side of loss is a preservation on some level of the taste of that loss itself without becoming completely mired in it. So our instincts when our worlds fall apart is often to withdraw or to move away or to not see or to hide or to break down parcha nishmatenu on some level. Our souls have taken flight during this time period. Parts of us all have gone into hiding on account of the totally destabilizing reality we are living with, and on account of the many losses, be they the lives of those we've loved, our own physical health, our own economic well-being. There's so many layers of loss that we are living with, so many ways in which we are living in proximity to despair. And so the rabbinic tradition though asks us to find a way to accommodate this new reality, one that incorporates the reality of davar mu'at, one that helps us live with the theological vertigo of coming undone. Whether it's through these legal norms or other communal practices that keep us going, that keep us in touch with all of those upbuilding parts of life. The tradition suggests to us that when we touch the davar mu'at, when we come into contact with this awareness that is not unique to this time, but ought to be ever present, but only becomes revealed sometimes in moments of tremendous rupture, that awareness of the hair's breadth between life and death. When we come into awareness of the davar mu'at, we respond with a davar mu'at. We respond by holding close this awareness because it is hard won, but not allowing ourselves to be overcome by it. And so it seems to me that we Jews live inside of a historical tradition and literary tradition that has reckoned in so many ways with destruction and despair, that has reckoned with loss and with proximity to loss. It has reckoned with the dizziness of it all, the undoing that all of this wreaks on our bodies, minds, and souls. And it invites us to not push it away, but to actually find ways to build and rebuild, maintaining awareness of davar mu'at, but living nonetheless on top of it, with it, in relationship to it. May it be so for us.